Bananas. The most popular fruit in the world. But I want to tell you a story you've probably never heard about how bananas have come to us at an unthinkable cost.
Mi vida hubo un cambio en la salud completamente mal.
It's a story about an extremely toxic pesticide, a chemical that may have deprived tens of thousands of people of the ability to have children in Latin America and across the world.
I had no idea at all that we had any kind of a process that could do such a thing to a human being.
It's a pesticide known as dibromochloropropaned, DBCP for short. Developed by multinational corporations Dow and Shell, it was meant to protect crops from a particularly harmful pest. It was effective and cheap, so fruit companies like Dole and Chiquita purchased the pesticide in massive quantities for their banana plantations at home and abroad. But there was something absolutely horrific about DBCP. It could cause permanent sterility in men.
¿Y quiénes aquí son estériles? Por favor, levante la mano.
For the tens of thousands of farm workers who spent years working with it or near it, repeated exposure to DBCP meant they might never be able to have children, ever.
How did that make you feel?
¿Cómo te sentiste?
After realizing its side effects, the US banned DBCP, but American companies continued to buy it and apply it on their banana plantations abroad.
Ahora, el capitalismo cuida al capitalismo, y nosotros quién nos cuida.
But for the past several decades, these farm workers, many of them now retired, have been fighting back.
Trabajó muchos años y nunca le pagaron a él un 5 de la bananera.
They're known as the afectados, the affected ones in Spanish. And in their old age and ailing bodies, they're filing lawsuits against some of the biggest corporations in the world.
Todavía estamos luchando hasta que Dios lo llame a cuenta.
I'm not going to abandon these workers who have been exploited and harmed by American corporations.
Estoy tratando de hablar con administradores. Nadie quiere hablar conmigo.
Hay gente que son muy cobardes.
Les muestren a los gringos lo que han hecho con nosotros, porque nosotros no somos perros, somos gente.
Okay, so we're about to go into this park where one of the organizers we've been in touch with has put together a group of afectados. We're gonna go meet with them. I think it's supposed to be a small group. Can't imagine this is them.
Oh, wow. ¿Todos son afectados?
Todo. Y eso es poco.
Oh, my.
There's a lot of people.
Queremos hablar con la mayor cantidad de las personas que podemos.
Ya que muchos compañeros se han muerto, dándose cuenta en los Estados Unidos que eso era un veneno para los trabajadores, entonces no lo ocuparon allá, lo mandaron para las bananeras de Costa Rica.
I spoke to so many of these afectados, many of whom eagerly gathered around me to wait their turn to speak.
Vamos a hablar con usted después.
Almost all of them were former farm workers, most of whom worked for Standard Fruit, the company we now know as Dole. And many have been protesting not just for years, but for decades. They claim to have suffered a host of different medical conditions that they all attributed to DBCP.
¿Cuáles padecimientos tiene usted?
Padezco leucemia y yo tengo demasiadas operaciones. Dañaba la vista.
Se me reventaba la piel y todo.
But of course, there was one that came up again and again.
¿Ya no tiene ningunos hijos?
Yo soy estéril, nunca pude engendrar hijos.
Soy estéril total. Tengo 45 años de casado y no hay hijos.
Y yo quise tener un hijo, no pude. ¿Por qué vivir?
¿Usted usaba el Nemagon, el DBCP?
Sí.
Nemagon, that's one of the commercial brand names for DBCP. It's the word a lot of the folks here use when they refer to the pesticide.
¿Tuvieron en estos años equipo de protección?
Nada, absolutamente nada.
Ni una mascarilla, nada.
¿Y qué es su mensaje para las empresas estadounidenses?
Que nos paguen el daño que nos hicieron.
So this begs the question, how did all this happen? Why did it happen? One person I knew could help explain things was Scott Hendler. He's an American lawyer who's been representing Costa Rica's afectados for over 30 years, and his cases have gone as far as the US Supreme Court.
It really starts back in the 1950s. Shell Chemical Company and Dow Chemical Company started researching ways to eradicate or eliminate microscopic worms that attack the roots of a plant.
Dow and Shell eventually came across a highly effective chemical compound that would kill the worms, called nematodes, but keep the plant alive.
DBCP, dibromochloropropaned.
In the 1950s, the two companies began to test DBCP for hazards as they prepared to sell it. But what their scientists found was unsettling. Tests on rats showed that DBCP could be absorbed by skin contact or simply by breathing it in. At the lowest exposure levels, inhaling the chemical caused the rat's testicles to shrink, and so a reduction in sperm count. There was also damage to various organs like the lungs, liver, and kidneys. At a higher exposure, most of the rats' testicles had shrunk to half their normal size. At the highest exposure, every single rat was fully sterile. Their bodies weren't producing any sperm at all.
The scientists were saying, hey, this stuff is dangerous. It can cause all of these other injuries, not just affecting reproductive capacity, but other kinds of issues. And so the marketers who were concerned about making a profit tended to ignore what the scientists were saying or downplay what the scientists were saying in order to get the product on the market. And there's some very damning evidence along those lines.
The Dr. Hine letter.
Yeah.
In 1961, Dow and Shell hired Dr. Charles Hine to draft a report to help register the pesticide with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. In a version of this report that we obtained, Dr. Hine described the dangers of DBCP seen in animal testing. He wrote that workplace concentrations of DBCP should not exceed 1 part per million, and that workers should be given impermeable protective gear if there was a risk of skin contact with the pesticide. But a Shell manager reviewing the draft in 1962 asked for key parts on the safety hazards to be removed. In notes scribbled on the margins, he advised Hine to leave out speculation about possible harmful conditions to man.
This isn't a treatise on safe use. That was their attitude.
This letter is pretty damning, and I've seen the actual document.
The chemical companies, Shell and Dow, knew of the toxicity of this chemical before they put it on the market. I just don't think there's any real dispute about that.
Though toxicological testing was still incomplete, sales of DBCP began.
The banana companies. Explain a little bit about what role they played in all this.
Dole bought the Standard Fruit Company, which was a banana company that had been growing bananas in Costa Rica and other Central American countries for many decades. So when they took over the banana producing operations, they said, well, let's try using DBCP on our banana plantations.
By the 70s, Dole and other banana companies were using DBCP widely. Not just in Costa Rica, but also in Honduras, Nicaragua, Ecuador, the Philippines, Ivory Coast, and more.
There was a lot of money being made by the chemical companies, a lot of money being made by the banana companies using the chemical because it increased their fruit production. And the way it's applied also really contributed to the exposure to workers.
One of the most common ways of applying DBCP, especially in Costa Rica, was to inject it into the soil with a specialized injector. But this created a problem.
Every time they injected it into the ground, this chemical vaporizes and it comes out of the soil into the air. And all of a sudden, the amount of volatilized chemical in the air is overwhelming.
Under the canopy of like the banana leaves as well.
So the chemical is trapped. It's not dispersing into the air beyond the banana plantation in a way that would make it less toxic. It wasn't just the workers applying it, it was the workers who were trimming the plants, picking the bananas, working at other tasks were also exposed.
Despite all this, Scott says the banana companies systematically failed to mitigate the harm.
The employers didn't provide the kind of equipment that you needed to protect yourself. And if a worker wanted to have a job and feed his family, he had to go along with what the employer was requiring.
Juan Hernandez was one of those workers.
Bueno, vamos adentro.
He says he was exposed to DBCP at some point between 1968 and 1980, while he was working for banana companies including Dole, which was previously known as Standard Fruit. And Juan showed us exactly how he was told to apply DBCP to the banana plants.
Este inyector fue uno de los primeros usados en el año 69. Uno hacía así, vea, así.
Ah.
Aquí otra, así.
Wow. ¿Y cuántos debería hacer?
Si vamos contando son por lo menos unas 10 veces o 12.
¿Por cada árbol?
Sí, alrededor de toda la mata. El DBCP era muy fuerte.
Así, ¿y estaba respirándolo?
Sí, entonces obviamente que al salir a la superficie aquí, uno lo respiraba.
¿Y tuvo contacto?
Sin ningún tipo de protección de nada.
Sin ninguna protección?
Nada.
Juan's experience tracks with most reporting on the topic, which shows that the farm workers overwhelmingly were not provided protective gear. When we reached out to Dole about whether protective gear was provided, they didn't respond.
¿Usted es estéril?
Yo soy estéril. Yo me di cuenta de que era estéril cuando tenía una pareja y no quedaba embarazada.
¿Supo usted que la razón fue el nemagón?
Y supe exactamente que la razón fue el nemagón.
¿Por qué supo?
Porque así dieron el resultado de los exámenes.
Juan showed us one of his spermograms. It showed that he's azospermic, meaning his body does not produce any sperm whatsoever.
Es triste saber que uno es un hombre y tiene su compañera y con la compañera tiene propósitos de reproducción y anudarse, pues se entra ya en otra dinámica en el mismo hogar.
So drops of DBCP would fall onto your skin.
Sí, y ardía. El vapor, vamos a ver, como era tan fuerte el olor, para decirles que el olor era tan insoportable que hubieron efectos colaterales hacia otras personas que no necesariamente aplicaban. Viera usted después de una aplicación entrar otro día, porque había como cierto, lo que llamamos nosotros, niebla, y era un olor insoportable.
DBCP is clearly smellable at a concentration of 1.7 parts per million, but scientists had said that the chemical should be kept below 1 part per million to keep workers safe.
¿Me puede describir qué pasó con su pareja?
Ella pues resulta embarazada. Obviamente la mujer es que tuvo relaciones con otra pareja. Hay que recordar que los afectados de nemagón tuvo efectos colaterales también. Algunos entran en depresión y se matan.
In 1977, things took a decisive turn at a chemical plant in California where American factory workers were manufacturing DBCP.
And as the story goes, some of the wives of these workers were chatting at a softball game. And they were all trying to get pregnant, and they couldn't get pregnant. They started comparing notes, and they realized the one thing they had in common were their husbands worked at this plant. The husbands got tested, dozens of them were turning up sterile. OSHA came in, their union came in, they did an investigation, they determined that DBCP was the culprit.
The workers ended up suing Dow and Shell. In response to all this, the US government declared DBCP an imminent hazard and imposed restrictions on its use. They said it could cause sterility and even potentially cancer. Dow and Shell both stopped producing the pesticide and notified buyers. As for the fruit companies, many stopped using DBCP altogether. But standard fruit, known today as Dole, persisted. They continued using DBCP, fearing a significant effect on their operation if they stopped immediately. When Dow refused to sell it to them, Dole's managers threatened to sue Dow over a breach of contract. Eventually, Dow caved to the pressure. They would resume selling their remaining supplies of DBCP to Dole, but under two conditions. For one, they requested that Dole follow more stringent safety protocols to protect their workers. And two, they wanted Dole to absolve them of any responsibility if anyone were to get sick or hurt. And Dole, for its part, agreed to the terms by signing an indemnity agreement. But internal memos from a Dole executive revealed that some of the safety protocols requested by Dow were disregarded. In fact, the executive noted that enforcing all of them would be near impossible.
So despite the knowledge that this was making workers sterile, the companies, both Dow and Shell and Dole in particular, continued to use this chemical after 1977.
When asked about this, a Shell spokesperson told us the company stopped manufacturing and selling DBCP in 1977. But documents we obtained on official Shell letterhead suggest that a branch of Shell Chemical continued to sell DBCP in Ivory Coast up until the early 1980s. This, however, was denied by Shell, and when we presented these documents to them, they said they had no further comment. Meanwhile, a Dow spokesperson confirmed that the company did keep selling, shipping, and manufacturing DBCP until October 1979. That's an important moment. It's when the US government took a more forceful step, fully banning the use of DBCP on all crops except for pineapples in Hawaii. This, however, did not completely stop the use of DBCP overseas. In fact, US law actually allows banned pesticides to be manufactured and sold abroad by American companies, as long as they aren't used on Americans at home. As Juan and others became aware of their sterility, they joined lawsuits filed in the US against both the chemical and banana companies. Over the years, the lawsuits have encompassed tens of thousands of former workers from Africa, Latin America, and the Philippines, many of whom worked on Dole, Chiquita, and Del Monte plantations. Some cases were quietly settled outside of court, but the individual payouts to the workers overseas were often paltry sums.
Sí, yo recibí una indemnización.
¿Fue bastante?
No. Algunos otros agarraron o les dieron muy poco y otros se han muerto esperando que los indemnicen.
Juan told us he received a $7,000 payout in 1992, but others reportedly received as little as $100. The American workers who suffered from sterility in California received much more, anywhere from $50,000 to $2.3 million per person. And there's another issue. The farm workers have rarely gotten a fair shake in American courts. Before a jury even begins to hear their stories, the defense attorneys often get the cases dismissed on technical grounds, passing the case from one court to another.
This really gets to the heart of the story. These companies, they have gone to great lengths, extraordinary lengths, and spent tens of millions of dollars to prevent the cases from getting to court on the merits, because they are so, in my opinion, afraid of the evidence. The evidence is so damning that I think most juries are going to rule for the workers.
It just seems like this case has been dragging on for so long. People are getting very old. One of the workers we were going to interview today passed away just a few weeks ago. Is there some intentionality to this?
I don't know what their thinking is. I'm not a mind reader, but as a lawyer who's been practicing in this field for over 30 years, I can tell you that it's not uncommon for defense lawyers to try to delay things in the hope that a plaintiff will die or abandon the case.
To this day, on Dole's front page of their website, they have a page dedicated to explaining their role in this whole DBCP situation. And they say that Dole stopped purchasing DBCP in 1979, and their specific language is that there is no evidence that Dole's use of DBCP caused any of the health effects that are described by the workers.
As I understand Dole's defenses, they're parsing words, and they're trying to say, well, it might cause those effects under certain circumstances, but it didn't cause those effects under the circumstances that we used it in. But that belies the evidence, in my opinion. The evidence, at least my clients, have significant exposure who both my experts and defense experts have confirmed have the kind of injuries you would expect from substantial DBCP exposure.
In the course of our reporting on the connection between DBCP and sterility, we reached out to Dole, Del Monte, Chiquita, Dow, and Shell for comment. Chiquita did not respond to any of our emails. Shell said their sales in Costa Rica were limited, and that tests have shown that many of those claiming fertility issues do not actually have them. For those that do, Shell said it has not been shown to be related to DBCP. But they went on to say that like other companies that sold or used DBCP many decades ago, they've since resolved thousands of claims related to the pesticide. Del Monte told us that they stopped using DBCP in 1977, but they also said they've been named in lawsuits in U.S. courts by Costa Rican banana workers, and that the vast majority of these claims were settled in the 90s. Dole, for its part, referred us to the statement on their website that I mentioned before. But what's interesting is in that same statement, Dole also says they have programs whereby male banana workers who demonstrate impaired fertility and meet certain criteria are fairly compensated. As for Dow, a spokesperson told us that any claim that DBCP caused sterility in thousands of farm workers is categorically false. Dow claimed the only scientifically established effect of DBCP to the male testes is at very high doses, which could potentially be experienced by manufacturing workers, but not by farm workers. We traveled a fair bit throughout Costa Rica, meeting dozens upon dozens of afectados, and both Dole and Dow's denials were difficult to square with what we heard and saw.
¿Cuándo estaban aplicando el Nemagón en estos años? ¿Tuvieron ustedes equipo de protección?
No.
Nadie.
Nada de ni guantes, ni delantal, ni mascarilla.
La ropa que nos llegamos a presentar, con eso nos mandaban a trabajar.
In the south of the country, we encountered another large gathering that rivaled the size of the first one we saw in San Jose.
¿Tiene hoy en día padecimientos a causa de su exposición a Nemagón?
Claro que sí.
Tengo mucha enfermedad.
Quiero saber un poco sobre su esposo.
Hace poco murió.
¿Y
No quiero ni acordarme.
Sí.
Porque él trabajó muchos años y nunca le pagaron a él un 5 de la bananera.
While most studies have looked at DBCP's links to sterility and cancer, research on its other effects have been limited. There are numerous studies that demonstrate organ damage in animals, but on the whole, studies on DBCP's impact on humans diminished after the 1979 ban. And there isn't much research involving women either, even though many were exposed at packing plants or at home, while, for example, washing DBCP-stained clothing.
Yo tuve 3 abortos. 2 abortos.
2 abortos, dígame más.
Dijo que era por el Nemagón.
And of course, regardless of where we went, the one thing that came up again and again was this.
¿Y quiénes aquí son estériles? Por favor, levante la mano.
Some even brought documents to prove their sterility.
Esterilidad.
Amid all of this, we spoke to a former supervisor for one of Dole's local operations. He told us he observed Dole continuing to use DBCP in Costa Rica from 1979 to 1981, after the US ban. He spoke to us on the condition that we keep his identity and voice anonymous.
¿Cuándo estaba usted trabajando allá? en los campos de Standard Fruit, ¿podría haber el uso de nemagón?
Claro que sí. Standard tenía 60 fincas en ese tiempo.
Sí.
Y yo manejaba ellas.
¿Está completamente seguro que en los campos de Standard Fruit todavía estaban usando el DBCP o el nemagón después del año 1979, sí?
Claro, porque cuando yo me vine todavía lo usábamos. Y yo vine al inicio del 81, nadie nos lo vino a decir, oiga, cuánto de peligroso era.
Estas compañías bananeras supieron que este químico fue prohibido en los Estados Unidos.
Siempre consideramos que las compañías veían a nosotros como conejillos de India. Una barbarie, tanta gente esterilizada.
When we shared the former supervisor's claims with Dole, they did not respond. But this story extends far beyond Costa Rica. We uncovered a paper trail of internal company memos further suggesting that Dole's use of DBCP continued around the world in the 80s. One, dated January 1985, shows a Dole manager discussing his company's use of DBCP in Honduras. A Dole billing invoice dated January 1986 shows sales of Fumazone, another brand name of DBCP, to the Philippines. In a 2007 court case, Dole's CEO explained how and why his company continued using DBCP well after the 1979 US ban.
You got a report that 10 out of 10 workers checked in Costa Rica were sterile. And when you got that report in 1978, the Nicaraguan division continued to use DBCP unchanged in 1978, 1979, and 1980, correct?
That's correct. We continued using DBCP in both Honduras and Nicaragua following the Costa Rican incident. As our people went out and talked to people, I recall no report back that we had infertility anyplace, and that's what gave us a great deal of comfort about using the chemical.
While the Costa Rican government banned imports of DBCP in 1979, what's more telling is what it didn't do. For one, they did not immediately cancel the registration of DBCP, nor did they hold the banana companies accountable. Bananas were big business in Costa Rica. They still are. But since the 70s, they've been steadily overtaken by something else: pineapples. Today, Costa Rica is the world's biggest exporter of pineapples, and also one of the biggest users of pesticides per capita. These pesticides have seeped into the country's water supply and even its air.
20 escolares se intoxicaron.
El río Cuarto de la Juela, al presentarse una intoxicación debido a un plaguicida.
Somos el basurero mundial de los pesticidas que nadie más quiere. Lo triste de esta historia es que el DBCP está siendo un ejemplo clarísimo de lo que vamos a poder ver dentro de 20 o 30 años. La razón fundamental por la cual Costa Rica es el principal consumidor de plaguicidas por hectárea del mundo es porque el Estado ha dejado de tener un rol protagónico. Están dejando solas y solos a las personas que están en el campo a la merced de las compañías transnacionales que llegan a vender sus pesticidas.
Si pudiera hablar directamente con las fincas bananeras, con las empresas, ¿qué diría a ellos?
Que por más poder económico que tengan las empresas, no pueden estar envenenando gente y el ambiente. Pero sobre todo que, aunque no hay dinero que justifique un pago a personas que quedaron estériles, que no pudieron procrear, pero que por lo menos se haga justicia en que haya una compensación justa y no miserable como la han venido dando.